Hello, good evening, and a warm welcome to today's BIC Streams session. KGF 2, Kolar Goldfields and Cornwall, exploring a shared history through the arts. We are excited to have with us today uh, the really fascinating group from Cornwall, the Rowan Tree music. We have Laura Fosten, Richard Trethewey, and Tom Fosten, along with Shrabonti Bagchi, who will be in conversation with them. The full bios of all the speakers will appear in the chat box on the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, of course, the speakers will take questions at the end of the session. You can put in your questions also at the bottom of your box next to the chat box. With that, I hand it over to Laura.
Thank you. So we've got a presentation we're going to show you first, and we're going to take turns to go through it. So Richard is going to start. I'll just share my screen with you all.
Yeah, so I'm Richard. I'm the violin or fiddle player, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about the history of emigration and Cornish miners. So Cornwall generally, if you don't know where it is, it's a land that lies at the very bottom of Britain. And you can see it highlighted here in red at the very, very bottom. It's an area that's traditionally thrived because of the traditional industries like farming and fishing and mining. It's got its own language, which is very different to English. There's no connectedness with English really. But it does have a lot of similarities with Wales and with the Breton language on the coast of France as well. And Cornwall's got a very long history with the arts, both visual arts and music, obviously. In Cornwall, we've got a saying, a phrase that wherever there's a hole in the earth, you'll find a Cornishman at the bottom of it. And this phrase is talking about how the Cornish travelled all over the world in search of work and opportunities. So by the mid-19th century, the mining industry in Cornwall, and particularly in the Camborne and Redruth area, which is mid to west Cornwall, it made this area the richest area in the world, which is incredible because now it's a very poor and very deprived area. It was the centre for industrial developments and even home to the first house in the world to be lit with gas lighting. And this was owned by William Murdoch, who was an engineer and an inventor. And he lit his home in 1792 with gas lighting. But in 1866, copper prices crashed and Cornwall's supply was waning. And what's more, rich deposits of copper were found overseas. And so for many, the only option was to seek work abroad, where there was not only a desperate need for their mining skills and expertise, but also fantastic opportunities for earning their living. The Cornish had emigrated before the 1860s, but this was the first time that it was forced upon them because of hardship. As early as the 1820s, there were large numbers of cousin Jacks working in Mexico in the silver mines, providing their highly sought knowledge of deep level mining. Cousin Jack is the name that the Cornishmen were given who were working abroad, and the name supposedly comes from Cornish miners already working abroad, requesting a job for their cousin back home. And the Cornish often use the word cousin to refer to friends or family alike. And then Cousin Jenny was the name given to Cornish women working abroad because the women, as you can see in this picture on the left-hand side, they also worked at the mine and they were bow maidens and would work on top of the mines, crushing up all the rocks and all the ore that was taken out. As early as 1816, the eminent Cornish engineer Richard Trethewey was taking high-pressure steam engines to Peru and paving the way for Cornish miners to follow him out to not only install these engines and pumps, but then to also work in the mines as well. So Cousin Jacks travelled extensively from Cornwall, from the mountains of Latin America to the Transvaal in South Africa, from California to Canada, and large communities gathered in some areas. The Copper Triangle on Australia's York Peninsula became known as Little Cornwall, and in the 1890s, over in California, in Grass Valley, over 60% of the entire population was Cornish. An estimated sum close to £1 million was being sent home to Cornwall from the Transvaal in South Africa alone at the turn of the 19th century. And some of the Cornish parishes and small villages at home were seriously deprived and very poor, and largely sustained exclusively on the money being sent home. Life was not always easy when settlers arrived at their destinations. In Australia's Copper Triangle in South Australia, some Cornishmen were unable to find affordable accommodation, so using their mining skills, they burrowed into the side of riverbanks and lived there. And this is a picture here from South Australia. And this is actually a picture on the right hand side. That's my granny, who is watching today at home. This was in 2002, so she's watching today. She's 96, and so she went to visit where the Cornish lived, and the Cornish chapels in Australia and the mines out there. Further movement, once they got to where they were going, the miners, was sometimes necessary as well. So when the minerals ran out in a particular place, miners then had to pick up and move on, or struggle and try and make a different living from farming, perhaps. There were still about 1,500 people living in dugouts like this on the banks of Burra Creek, even in 1850. Although the dugouts were whitewashed inside, ventilation was very poor, they were subject to flooding being on the riverbank, and disease was very common, and rubbish was often dumped at the creek as well. So outbreaks of typhus and typhoid fever were common. To avoid these problems, the company announced in 1851 that it would no longer employ any miners who lived in these dugouts. So now here's a photo of Cornish emigrants at Redruth train station, which was that town I said about that was very wealthy at the time. And so on the right hand side you can see a platform full of men exclusively, all packed up and ready to leave for South Africa in this particular photo. And then on top of the wall above them you can see that's almost exclusively women and children. So it's an incredibly moving picture which represents the emigration and the effect on Cornwall. And of course on the other platform on the left hand side, the incoming train line to Cornwall is completely empty. And this scene is, the train station there is identical today, and the rest of this photo you can see Carn Bray, which is a big monument to Cornish mining in the background, if you can see the whole photo. So the miners left a visible mark on the landscape wherever they went. Cornish engines and engine houses dominated the horizons from Spain to Central America, and some of these constructions are still standing today in these places. The Cornish style cottages can also be found across the world, and even house names and street names bear witness to the Cornish history. And last year I was fortunate enough to go to Mineral Point in Wisconsin in America and visited some of the Cornish cottages which are still standing, and they're now tourist attractions for people to go and see. And the bottom picture on this slide is one of those cottages there. And so as well as their mining skills, the Cornish emigrants carried their cultural way of life with them. They formed tight-knit communities and did not lose contact with either the people or the customs of their homeland. Wrestling competitions, or wrestling as they say in Cornwall, they took place in the new settlements where they visited and went to work, and Cornish Methodist chapels were constructed even in deepest Mexico. The Cornish took food with them that they would like to cook and eat at home. So then we now have pasties and saffron buns and saffron cakes being well known in Australia and America. And they also took their music with them, so the sounds of brass bands and Cornish carols resounded with the Cornish miners as well. The Cornish can also boast that they introduced football to Mexico. The very first Mexican football team was made up exclusively of Cornish miners, and the first club, Pachuca Athletic Club, originally comprised just Cornish mine workers. The Mexican League of Association Football was established in 1902, and the first championship was played that same year. And in 1904 and 1905 tournament, it was El Pachuca that won the first place. So, and it still to this day prides itself on being the home of Mexican football. And I think Mexico far exceeded English football in their achievements and abilities. There's a well-known statistic that between 1861 and 1901, it's estimated that Cornwall lost over 250,000 people who sought work in the United States, Canada, Australia, Mexico, New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil, and Chile. And when you think that Cornwall now has a population of about 500,000, to imagine the numbers that left in that time frame is amazing. And whilst this fact is talked about quite a lot in the history of Cornish mining, the story of the Cornish in India is seldom mentioned, and it's partly this that has inspired us to dig deeper and find out and protect these stories and the legacy of those who travelled to India, but also to tell the stories of the whole community that lived there. And I'm going to hand back to Laura, who's going to tell you some more information about the project.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So it might seem strange, this next slide, but this small caravan is where our Kolar Gold project very first started. My family for the last few years have rented out our house on Airbnb to tourists, because Cornwall's now a really big tourist area. And me and my whole family would go and live in this tiny little caravan in the summer. The picture is a bit misleading because it's really nice and sunny, but it actually rains most of the time in Cornwall throughout the year. And it was a rainy day in this caravan. I was watching a program about Indian music, and it just made me wonder whether there'd ever been any connection between Cornwall and India. So I did a Google search, and there was some information from India, but there was nothing, well, very little from Cornwall about Cornish miners, except I found one paragraph from a book called The Cornish Overseas by Philip Payton. And it said, although often invisible in the history of Cornish emigration, the Indian subcontinent in fact played a role of some significance in the Cornish diaspora. The bit of that really intrigued me was when he said it's often invisible in the history of Cornish emigration. And I wondered why that was, because as Rich has explained, the Cornish diaspora around the world is a huge part of Cornwall's history and the narrative. So I just wondered why India wasn't featured. So the next thing I did was to start researching, and I started with books. So here's a selection of some of the books that I turned to. This book by Dr. Sri Kumar is encyclopedic, really, about the Kolar Goldfields, and just taught me so much. And then the book by Bridget White Kumar, and also Gayatri Chandrasekhar's book, Grit and Gold. And I managed to email all those authors, and I was really stunned really by their response, because they were so generous with their time and their knowledge, and they all emailed me back and answered all the questions I had, and it really helped me build a picture and an understanding of KGF itself. But I was still quite a long way from finding out about the Cornish community there. So I then emailed Philip Payton, who wrote The Cornish Overseas, And he suggested I look at the British newspaper archives, which you can see if I wiggle my mouse. This is a screenshot from the British newspaper archives. And that really opened the door to learning about the Cornish community at KGF. It's a resource, anyone can access it. You have to pay a subscription, but you can pay either just to view a few pages or you can pay monthly. And they have records from newspapers in the UK dating back to the 1700s. And what I found when I started looking into them was that the Kolar Gold fields were being reported on weekly across Cornwall in all the newspapers. Often that was taken directly from Kolar Goldfields News, which I think was the paper at KGF at the time. And it was a vast array of information that was being reported on. So they would describe which miners were going out to KGF, how long their contracts were for. They would record when people were coming home on leave, how long their leave was. There was extensive reports about marriages, funerals, and in all of these, they would provide not only the information on the people getting married or the people that had died, but who from the Cornish community had attended these events. And what really interestingly from our point of view, what music was performed or what hymns were sung. So that really built such a picture, and a lot of the stories we uncovered came from the British newspaper archives. So that's a fantastic, really fantastic resource. So after doing all that research, we felt we had enough here to explore further. And as a band, we decided that we could expose this story that had been forgotten through the arts and particularly music. But we would need funding to do that. So we applied to the Cornwall Heritage Trust and Arts Council England for funding. And they amazingly both agreed to fund a project that would see us build a section on our website, a booklet, an album of music, and a short project film. So without that funding, the project couldn't have gone ahead. But when we applied, the project that the grant form we submitted was for a much smaller project than it turned out to be. So we anticipated in our funding bid that we might have 10 musicians contributing, including us contributing to the album. By the end of the project, we'd had over 60 musicians from Cornwall and India involved on playing on the album. We estimated there might be 20 participants in the project. So that's people from the community, historians, possibly involving schools. We thought 20 was, that was about right. By the end of the project, there'd been over 200 people from all around the world, people that were born at KGF, people whose families had lived at KGF. We had local school children. One local school was so inspired that they wrote, well, actually I worked with them and we wrote a actual play, a performance. They were only 5 and 6 year olds, but they did this whole performance for their parents about Cornish miners and particularly the stories of KGF. And that was really quite remarkable. So the funding itself, in the end, only covered the actual recording process. We made sure that the artists involved were paid and all the studio hire and the actual production of the CD was covered. But what wasn't covered by that funding was any travel to India. So we realized quite early on that that was going to be quite crucial, but we didn't have the funds to all come over as a band and actually work with the musicians. So in the end, both me and Tom self-funded trips to India and KGF to try in a small way to kind of fill that void in the project. It also didn't cover the time, research time, all the admin work. And so really this project, so many people contributed to it, most of whom received nothing for their time, but they did it for a passion to get these stories told. and it's the project's success and completion is really down to all these people across a wide spectrum, not just musicians, but artists, community members, historians, all these people that gave their time, their knowledge to support the project. So a key thing that has really helped move the project on was the website. If I wiggle my mouse, you should be able to see, this is our band website, and on it, we set up a whole section here for the Kolar Gold project. We started off with just some FAQs about what we were hoping to achieve. The Kolar Gold album, once the album had actually been released, we've put the whole album on our website. And if you go to that page and scroll right down, the whole booklet is there as well. The project is not for profit. All profits made from the album itself are split equally between the Cornwall Heritage Trust and the KGF Schools Foundation. But we were aware that not everyone would be able to actually buy the album, and the main priority of the project itself was to fill this gap in the history, the shared history between Cornwall and KGF. So we wanted the music and the stories to be accessible to people regardless of their financial position. So the whole album is on there now. There's a brief history of KGF, which the authors I mentioned previously helped put together. It's really a snapshot, and we do signpost people to books and other resources if they want to explore it further. The story section, that covers stories, a real wide range of stories that illustrate predominantly the Cornish experience at KGF. So I won't go into them all in detail, but there's the story of a young woman who, newly married, went over. She was a singer and became really involved in the Wesleyan chapels at KGF. She was there under a year before she died in childbirth. But the story, the report of her funeral tells an awful lot about the tight-knit community that was there and just how many people turned out, and what an important part she was of the community. There's a story of a young miner who was involved in an air blast in the mines and was sent back to Cornwall, but his mental health was so badly affected that he ended up taking his own life. There's a story of one of the very first Cornish miners who travelled out there, and actually we were lucky enough to meet his great nephew, I think, who still lives behind the pub where his great uncle was recruited by a mine speculator to travel out in the 1800s. Then we've got a project blog, which we just documented our progress as we went along. And if you want more detail about mine and Tom's visits to KGF, you can find them there. The Get Involved section, that was really crucial to unlocking the ability of people to contribute and participate in the project. So we have had people from all around the world using that Get Involved page to email us. Some have questions. A lot, though, have either personal experience of being in KGF, or they had family that were born there. And lots of them have primary source material from the time. They have photographs. We've had some lovely lady called Pauline has these letters. There's all sorts of information. And although the project officially concluded in February, people are still getting in touch. And actually this week I've had someone email me to say his grandfather was at KGF in the early 1900s and wrote memoirs of his time there that described not just they described like the engineering and things, but also the living and working conditions. And he said that he will share more of those memoirs with us. So it's an ongoing process, I'd say, but that really helps people kind of access the project. Let's go to the next slide. So as I said, people have been involved in this from all around the world. These are just some of the countries that people have got in touch from, and that I think there's only so much we could do on our own. Really, the credit for the project goes to all these other people that have got involved. so many people have opened their homes and their family histories to us and shared quite personal photographs or memories of their time. And this is from both the Cornish and the Indian communities, although obviously in Cornwall we've been able to go and meet these people. The top photograph here is a lady called Pauline, who Rich will talk about more in a little while. And her dad wrote letters from KGF that he sent back to Cornwall that she shared with us. And actually, one thing I forgot to mention about the website, there's a resources page, and you can read one of his letters on that page. There's also a list of all the Cornish miners we know are there, and a list of all the music that we know was either played or sung. Another picture just down here. This is the great nephew of one of the first Cornishmen to go. And so all these different people have got involved. And I think that's been one of the successes of the project, really, is that people have had an outlet to share their experiences. And it's the one thing that they all have in common, I'd say, is their love for KGF. Wherever they now are in the world, it's KGF is so important to them, and has such a strong place in their hearts, and that comes across in everyone we speak to, even people that maybe it was their grandfather that was there. They're fascinated by this part of their family history, and there's a real desire for people to explore and learn more about it. Right, so as I said, we weren't funded to actually come to KGF, but initially we thought it would be possible to do it all from Cornwall, which was just so foolish because you can't do a project about a place that you've never visited, or you could, but I think it wouldn't be as valid, really. So we needed to make sure at least some of us had come. So I had a week. Luckily my best friend lives in Bangalore, so I came over and stayed with her, and there were two aims to that week I spent. One was to visit KGF, and the other was to get the ball rolling with the recording process. So on my visit to KGF, I was going to go with Bridget White Kumar, but she was poorly, so I was shown around by Neil Joseph from the KGF Schools Foundation, and that was really amazing for us to see, because obviously the profits from the project, half of them will go to the Schools Foundation, and the work that they were doing there, not just in the school but the community, was really inspiring. And it was also fascinating to hear his experience of growing up in the community, and again he reflected that sense that we've got from everyone about what a special place it is, and just how strong the community spirit was, particularly when he was growing up. I got to see the mining areas and look in some of the old European homes as well. I got to very briefly meet Dr. Sri Kumar, which was absolutely fascinating, and he's really supported and helped the project a lot. He gave a lot of his expertise and time, and was so grateful for that. I would have loved to have longer to talk to him because he was so knowledgeable, but I'll have to save that for another visit, I think. And then I was working, I spent several days at the studio of Venki DC in Bangalore. I won't say too much about this because I'll steal Tom's thunder. But really the purpose of that was to meet together and kind of share a vision for how we can bring these two areas of history together, these two styles, through the music. So we spent a few days just laying down the guide tracks so that we had a rough idea where the music was going to be going, so we could all add in our parts. I never want those guide tracks to surface, because I had to pretend to be a violin, I had to pretend to be a flute, I had to pretend to be a male voice choir, all just humming these lines so that we'd have something rough to work on. I also, we got most of one of the songs finished during that week in Bangalore, where the vocal is shared between me and Gayatri Chandrasekhar and Nyla Saldana from KGF. Gayatri I'd been in touch with over several months, she'd been helping with the historical research. And then she said, oh yes, I'm a Carnatic singer. And I thought, oh, well, that would be amazing if we could have her actually musically on the album, as well as her assistance with the research. So she came one day and we worked together, and she absolutely amazing skill. And for me to hear her and Venki and their contribution was just mind-blowing, really. They're both very, very talented. So I've talked long enough, I think. I'm going to hand back to Rich, who's going to just talk through one of the stories we uncovered. Mute myself.
Oh, thank you, Laura. So yeah, Laura mentioned the letters that our friend Pauline, who lives at Perranporth, that she's got, that are an incredible resource and treasures for her family, more than that. So I'm not a prolific songwriter, but I have written several songs now relating to the incredible stories from Cornwall's rich history. And it's when a story's got many layers of unbelievable yet true components, I feel compelled to write a song to try and protect the memory and legacy of such amazing events. And when I heard the story of Roy and Olive Tamblyn, I knew that I had to write the song of their story. We came to learn of Olive and Roy's story through one of the many coincidences that have littered this project. As Laura said, we'd applied to the Cornwall Heritage Trust for funding, and our application landed on the desk of Alison Bick, who saw the words Kolar Goldfields and couldn't believe it. And the story that follows is that of her grandparents and parents to Pauline then, who lives in Perranporth, but whose life started 78 years ago in the Kolar Goldfields. So Arthur Roy Tamblyn and Olive Augusta Westcott were both born and grew up in the early part of the 20th century in Perranporth on the coast in Cornwall. And Roy Tamblyn trained at the Camborne School of Mines, and he was a mining engineer who'd already worked in Portugal but had recently left the sands of Perranporth for those of southern India. And Olive was working in the post office at Perranporth when Roy's sister tried to post a package to the Kolar Goldfields back to Roy. So Olive took a look at this parcel and said it would never reach India, and so she repackaged it and carefully sewed this package together into some material, and it arrived safely in India. And this started a correspondence then across the continents between Roy and Olive. And so we're incredibly lucky to have seen these letters that Roy sent home to his family. And he was a fantastic letter writer and included so much detail about the journey there on the ship he was on. He included temperatures of the water and of the swimming pool on board the ship, speed that the boat was travelling at, maps and so on. And I think this reflects his attention to detail probably as a Cornish mining engineer. He wrote of his voyage there, much of which has inspired the opening track on the album, the SS Carthage, which was the name of the ship that he sailed on in 1935. And he told of seeing whales swimming alongside the ship and blowing water and air out through their blowholes. And he talked about the night sky as they travelled through the Mediterranean as well. So Roy and Olive enjoyed a 3-year long-distance courtship letter writing before Roy took 6 weeks leave, returning to Cornwall and then marrying Olive. And the couple then returned to India, where they had 2 children, and then came back in 1947, shortly before Indian independence. So their daughter, Pauline, who was born at KGF, has become a great friend to us, and it's a constant source of inspiration and encouragement for everything we do. And when we were first talking about writing this song, Laura and I spent an afternoon and had a delicious lunch because she's a fantastic cook, with Pauline, and she let me record our conversation and her memories of being a little girl in India, um, as well as talking us through a lot of these amazing photos that you can see there on the screen. Yeah, so I had this amazing, um, rich resource then of Pauline's first-hand memories of being a little girl in India, as well as these letters as well. And so then the song takes some of Pauline's words and then some of the words from the letter, um, and Pauline's memories of, she can remember the skies turning green and smelling monsoons coming and hearing that on the trees, and these words all made it into the song. Um, and then from this one story, let alone the whole album, this one story, as Laura said, inspired a school production at Camelford School, and they turned it into that production, which Pauline then attended as well. So it's also opened up a whole other world to Pauline as a participant, um, who's now met all these other people and become friends, and really opened up her world as well. Um, and then from that, the school were then signposted onto the use of other artifacts and museums in Cornwall. So there's Givor Tin Mine, which is a museum dedicated to Cornish mining, down in West Cornwall. Um, and so then we were able to link the school in with them, and they formed group links with singing groups, the Boscastle Boys, and then we're also able to signpost them onto musical resources made by people we know as well, full of Cornish songs and history and activities for children. And so that was all from one song, let alone the whole project. Um, so it's been incredibly rewarding for us to see, participants of our projects becoming so involved in local culture and community. And a lot of that was before the project had even been published and before it was finished. Um, I'll hand over to Tom, who will talk about the music. And if we're not able to find the letter, as Laura said, there's a lot of stuff on the website, but hopefully we can find that. But here's Tom anyway.
Sorry, I'll just quickly interrupt. Can you hear me? I've just got my folder out and I realised that I passed I passed my copy of the letters onto a journalist, because we were on BBC, local BBC, when we launched the project, and she asked for all my information. So I don't have my physical copy, and I can't go onto my electronic copy because I'm sharing my screen. But there are letters on the website, and actually, if the KGF one isn't on there, I will take a photo of it and make sure it's up on the website later on this afternoon.
Actually, Roy Tamblin's letter is on the website, and I can see it on the website.
Oh, great.
Crack on.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about how we approached the musical side. This was probably the main thrust of the project, was trying to find a way of representing the shared cultures, the Cornish and the Indian, that were present at KGF during the time that we were focused on. So from the Cornish side, this was fairly straightforward for us. We're a Cornish band, we sing in the Cornish language, and that's our kind of daily music that we're involved in. We're also very lucky to have Richard in our band. Richard's recently been made a bard, which is a kind of honour bestowed on people who've contributed a lot to the Cornish culture. So that was fairly straightforward. And there's kind of three strands of Cornish music, which I think you'll be able to, if you should ever listen to the album, you should come across quite well. So number one is the kind of shared folk tradition that you'll find echoes of throughout the British Isles. So if you're familiar with Scots or Irish, Welsh, English folk music, you'll definitely hear echoes of that within Cornish music. It's sort of proximity, I suppose. The second strand that we'll come across in the work we were putting together is the result of the growth in Cornwall of a non-conformist religion, so a kind of Christianity, specifically Methodism, which really became prevalent in Cornwall in the 18th, 19th centuries. This was important because it brought with it certain musical traditions. So non-conformist Methodist religion was a very kind of earthy, kind of working class religion that really spoke about the kind of immediate pressures that communities were feeling, and this is partly why it was really taken up by mining communities, and hence why it was so prevalent in Cornwall. It brought with it a real sense of the importance of singing together, and these incredible hymns were written that dealt with the big stuff in life that people in those communities were facing. So things like going to work in particularly dangerous industries like mining, the risk of death or injury, and so group singing and the hymns associated with that became a real important part of Cornish music. And the second thing, of course, is the growth of brass bands that are often associated with these communities as well. And so both of these elements appear in our album. The third element that you'll see from Cornish music that features in our album is the connection with Brittany in northern France. This is really closely culturally linked with Cornwall, and it has a real unique aspect, which is the use of 5/4 time signatures within music. This is not something you tend to find particularly in the folk traditions of other parts of the British Isles. It is quite particular to Cornwall and Brittany, and so we included that in the final track of our album. Was written consciously in that style. So that was the Cornish aspect. The Indian aspect was a different matter altogether, because we're fans of Indian music, but we know enough to know that that we could never kind of recreate this sort of level of complexity and the historical grounding of Indian classical music, Indian folk music. But we were very lucky that we found some incredible musicians to work with and meet that requirement. As Laura mentioned, myself and her were both able to travel to Bangalore and meet with musicians there. And the interesting thing about that was that you really got a sense that the musicians we were working with had really kind of dedicated their lives to the study of Indian music, and and were able to contribute so much to this project. We're very fortunate to be linked up with Venki DC, a chap in Bangalore who runs SUR Productions, and he in turn brought in all manner of absolutely wonderful Indian musicians into the project, which really helped to sort of balance the Cornish side with the Indian side. Logistically, it was quite challenging. Even on our part, we don't all live sort of particularly close to each other. I personally live on the other side of the country from Cornwall, so all the recordings were done at various locations, some in Bangalore, some in Cornwall, some elsewhere in England, and then it was quite a job kind of putting them all together. What we were able to do, due to the caliber of the Indian musicians, we were able to give them fairly loose parameters, I would say, and allow them to kind of fill in the gaps, so to speak. And then we would sort of combine it all together. It went through a process of editing and mixing, and we came out with the finished articles. But it often wasn't that we started off with a set goal in mind for a song. We would let it kind of evolve and let different voices representing the two cultures feed into it and try and parcel together something cohesive at the end of it. In terms of how we selected the pieces of music to appear on the album, so there's a few different kinds of tunes and songs. So we, as Rich has alluded to, we wrote some original songs, which were in there to kind of tell a particular story, like as was just mentioned, or to represent a certain group of people that were present in KGF during the time the project's focused on. we also composed some original instrumental music. And the idea with this was to kind of create a mood, or try and find a kind of more fundamental level to tell the stories at. So it was more about giving it a sense of kind of how it would feel to be there, how that experience would feel to you. We also found, and this came from the newspaper archives that Laura had access to, so we were able to find out lists of various songs, and you will see on this slide here, various songs and religious hymns that were sung in KGF at the time we're focused on. And we included 2 hymns on our album from this, one of which, Lead Kindly Light, we know has been sung in mining communities throughout the world. And we're fairly sure another one, Am I Born to Die, was included in KGF. And then finally, we also included some traditional folk songs as well. There's a particular one called 10,000 Miles, which sort of tells the story of 2 lovers separated by a vast distance. And we included that song because there's so many personal stories of families who have been kept at a distance, or Cornish and Indian families who were coming together across a divide. And so that was the final category of song we included. So I think a good way of illustrating all the different strands that came together to make this project what it was is if we listen to one of the tunes. So we're going to listen to a song called Am I Born to Die? So this was a hymn written by Charles Wesley, and part of that Methodist tradition that I spoke about earlier. We used this earlier in the year, so we launched the project, and then obviously coronavirus happened, and we weren't able to play live. We weren't able to meet people, and so we wanted to host some sort of virtual event where we could connect with the other musicians involved in the project. Obviously our band, there are 2 more of us than you see today, as well as supporters and people who'd been really interested in the whole project. So we decided to hold a listening party where we would listen through the album and have sort of conversation, question and answers about each track. So we're going to listen to a section of that in a minute, which is Am I Born to Die, this hymn. But just to explain why I feel like this represents the project so well. So if we go through the hymn, so the first verse is sung by Richard in English. The second verse is sung by a wonderful singer named Pooja, who sings in Tamil. And then following her verse, there's a flute instrumental. Now, this was actually a traditional Tamil mining song, which was collected by Dr. Sri Kumar, who Laura referred to earlier. He made a recording of an elderly chap singing this tune, which we then transcribed for the flute. So that features there. Following that, there's a male voice group from Bangalore who sing in Canada. And then finally, there's the Truro Cathedral Choir who sing the final verse. And that we felt was particularly relevant because the flag or the regimental colours of the KGF battalion were hung up in Truro Cathedral for a number of years. So to have the Truro Cathedral Choir, Truro is the city of Cornwall, to have that choir feature on the album seemed really appropriate. So that's a kind of way of illustrating all the different strands that we pulled together in this project. So we'll play the video, and obviously any questions or comments about the musical side of things we'd love to talk about afterwards.
Shall we talk about Am I Born to Die?
Yeah.
Really tricky just because there's so many people involved in this track from, in the UK and in India. We had the choral scholars, didn't we? We had Jessica Quinones on flute, and then we had Pooja Prakash Raj vocals, and then your guys, Venki, who did, like, when we heard that particular verse they'd sung, it blew us away because they are so tight.
Yeah.
It was like you'd taken one voice and layered it up electronically, but they were all singing live. We've got the video, so we know they were all singing, but it sounds almost electronic because they are so together. Was it like, did it take a lot of work to get that so perfect?
Not at all. Like they means I explained the whole thing and they digested it. And the thing is, whenever these boys, I call them the boys because it's like they're all of same age, and some of them are like they just completed their studies and they're getting into new jobs, but their upbringing is very strong in the Indian classical music. So they have a very beautiful, like tuned ear, very much conditioned. And the moment I sing, their melody sense is so strong that they decipher it very soon. So, and the moment they understand it, then they start playing around and they are like joking around each other and pulling each other's legs. And I tell, take one, ready, one shot. Take two, like adding up some layers, four or 2 layers. I did it, and that's it. Then had same, the Indian food and enjoy. It was a good thing. Because of you, we had a get together after a long time.
Oh, that's good. I
Because of this project, rather.
But when I saw the video of them recording it, I thought, oh, I recognise some of them from when I was there.
Yeah. In the video, they're serious.
Say again?
In the video, they are like pretty serious, but the moment the video is off, you should see them.
I think the thing that's really, really clear is that with all these sort of the collaborators, all these excellent guys again, we are very much the weak links. The talent of the people we got to work with has been incredible. It really has.
I love the strings. The strings, the vina and the beautiful little string bits that were added into that verses as well. Beautiful. Really, really good.
Love this.
Hearing that about your boys and your choir, it's amazing the similarity between the choral scholars on the final verse. Actually, that they've got such an amazing training in classical music that they had sheet music for it, but had never seen the sheet music before, had never heard the song, and they sung it. And we did it in one take, I think, and then
they practiced, I think, twice, and then did 1 or 2 takes. It wasn't.
But I think we added takes because you feel you should.
Yeah.
I think it's like, well, that seemed fine, but we'll do another take
just in case. Yeah. It wasn't.
But it's lovely that there's that kind of parallel between the 2 male voice choirs, and talk about male voice choirs. Originally, we were going to have a full male voice choir singing at least part of this song. We were going to have a string quartet played by us at some stage in the development of this. The song was originally in 3/4 when I first heard it, and we put it into 4/4.
Partly so we could have that that flute tune added.
Yeah,
because that was in 4. It was sort of felt like it was in 4/4.
It was Dr. Sri Kumar from KGF came across an old Tamil song that he recorded, and he sent it to us, didn't he? And then you, Neil, transcribed the tune of that for Jessica to play on the flute.
2, 1, go. This is the bit with the manky guitar bit, isn't it? Yeah.
That was with this guitar. I didn't have a proper microphone. It was just this thing. I just thought, do some. I wanted to send something to the others to say, would something like this be okay? So I just did it quickly and sent it over. But then it ended up just making it into the end product.
This is the guitars are so much like in this whole album. I want to personally compliment you that it's very clean. That's what I love about this whole thing.
The tone of Pooja's voice. Oh, it's amazing.
Just, yeah, incredible.
Yeah, it kind of sums up the whole album, I think, the whole project, that one track.
Yeah.
Very much. Very much.
Great. Sorry, I realise we've talked for quite a long time, so I'll be brief. But we just wanted to finish the presentation by talking about the legacy of it and what we feel the legacy is and what we hope it will be, because obviously everything has been very disrupted by the current COVID situation. So one thing we know has come out of it, which I think is one of the most important things for us, is new relationships. It has really felt like a community has grown around the project, and friendships have been formed that transcend age, ethnicity, geography. People have made really strong friendships just linked by this history and their love for KGF. We've made lots of friends for life as well, and that's been a really positive thing to come out of it. Another thing has been the financial side, that hopefully we will be able to, we have been gathering money sales from CDs so far in preparation to send to the KGF Schools Foundation and Cornwall Heritage Trust. That's been slightly delayed because we had lots of events planned where we were going to promote and sell the album, and obviously everything has been cancelled, but that will happen within the next couple of months. Another thing is that hopefully we have changed the narrative in Cornwall about Cornish emigration, that no longer it will be, oh well, Cornish miners went to Australia and Canada and America, and now it will be and India, and that KGF will have its rightful importance in that conversation and that history. I think another lasting legacy hopefully is the website. We're still getting 100+ views a day. People aren't so interested in our band stuff really. It's the KGF stuff, which actually is great because that's what really we set it up for. And I mean, it's not a comprehensive guide to KGF or even the Cornish emigration, but it gives a flavour and hopefully encourages people to then explore further. Some things that we hope will be the legacy, that should have been the legacy but have been delayed. We were invited we were supposed in August to go to France, where we were going to perform at a festival that attracts 1 million visitors over its 10 days. And we were due to perform with Venki DC. He was going to come over from Bangalore so we could actually show the project from both sides. Obviously that was cancelled. We're hoping it will go ahead in 2021 because that will be a really good way of, again, kind of letting people know about this really important history. We'd hoped to come to India at some point and actually work in person with the musicians. We wanted to bring this to the people of KGF and perform at KGF, but obviously that has now been pushed far down the track That's like a one-day pipe dream now, but hopefully it will happen. We'd hope to organise reunion in Cornwall because there are lots of people now have met. At the start of this project, there were lots of people who were born at KGF who didn't think there was anyone else in Cornwall who was born at KGF or whose family had been there. And lots of them have been connected. There are still some people that haven't actually physically met with these other people. So we were hoping to be able to host a reunion of sorts, and obviously that's been delayed. You'll see in the photo, this photo looks so bizarre in the current climate because we have our arms around each other and it's in a packed theatre, and those things don't happen anymore. But we launched the album with a show in a theatre where we combined the stories. We had a narrator and we combined the music with the stories, and that was really successful. So our plan going forward was to do a more theatre-based thing with the project and get it out there to a wider audience. In terms of, there's so much more to research, and we're not necessarily the people to do that. So we've been putting feelers out, and just before lockdown, I'd met with a lecturer from Camborne School of Mines at Exeter University who was really keen to explore this further and possibly combine it with the arts, but obviously, again, another thing to be delayed. But we'll see what happens in the future. But I will stop talking now because I'm aware we're running out of time and we've gone on far longer than we were supposed to. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I just have one question, and then I can see that we have a couple of questions from people who've tuned in. So, Laura, actually, I wanted to ask you something, like in your music, the music that you've created, the original music, you brought all these musical influences together, like the beautiful song that we just heard. But, actually in KGF at that time when the Cornish miners were working here, how integrated were the communities, and did you find anything that, music dating back to then, which had this kind of a musical amalgamation?
No, I think from what we gathered, the communities were pretty separate. They were quite segregated, and I don't think, other than at work, I don't think the communities often mix. But we do know of marriages between Cornish miners and Indian women. Oh. There are some families living in Cornwall, but I think that was rare. I think that was the exception. So that has obviously been a real consideration during the project, that we don't want to misrepresent it. It's almost like we'll take the history and push it forward, and because now those barriers aren't there in the same way. Now we can work together with people from different cultures, and so we found music that we know was sung or performed by the Cornish, but not necessarily that was actually mixed. I think the brass band tradition is something that possibly did originate with the Cornish. I did have a brief message with I think the grandson or great grandson of one of the band leaders from KGF. So whether that came from a military background or whether that was a result of the Cornish there, we just don't know.
Right.
But yeah.
Right. And are there any, sort of Cornish families, or maybe, Cornish Indian families living in KGF or Bangalore or anywhere? Did you trace any of those families here? Or do you think most of them sort of emigrated back to England or to other parts of the...
I think most emigrated back to Cornwall. So I know of a couple of families in Cornwall. I think there are possibly illegitimate relations still living in Bangalore that weren't recognised. We've heard of unconfirmed rumours that aren't very edifying. Let's put it that way. Okay. So I think there possibly are, but not out there in the open.
Right. There are some questions. Isabella Simon asks, are the hymns Anglican or Methodist hymns? And she also asks, is there any semblance of Cornish music found in KGF? Which I think you've answered already in my question. But she has a question about the Anglican or the Methodist hymns. Like, were most of the hymns that were played there, what was the origin?
I think...
Do you want to...
feel free to jump in. I was going to say, so looking at Am I Born to Die? So that was written by Charles Wesley. So obviously he was very much involved in the Methodist movement, and his hymns had a big influence on the Methodist movement. He himself, nonetheless, did remain sort of fairly keen on the Anglican Church, the Church of England, throughout his life. So I personally don't know for sure whether it was sung more prevalently in one denomination or the other denomination. I mean, certainly today, in an Anglican church, it wouldn't be at all unusual to have hymns from the Methodist tradition, and possibly vice versa as well.
Oh, right. Okay. So just for everybody who's here, I mean, attending the session, I'll ask a few more questions of Laura and Tom and Richard. But meanwhile, you can keep sending in more questions in the Q&A box, and we'll keep sort of interweaving them. So another thing I wanted to ask you, especially Laura and Tom, since you traveled to India, traveled to KGF, and some of the most interesting stories that you heard, of course, came from people who wrote in and everything. So tell us a little bit more about some of these stories, like some of the ones that sort of stick in your mind. For instance, having gone through the website and having written about your work, I remember this Miner Jolly story, which kind of really stuck with me. So do you think you can recount a couple of those stories?
Yeah, do you want me to go, Tom? So we included the Miner Jolly story because we thought it highlighted some of the inequalities really that were going on at the time. And actually one of the tracks on our album is called Miner Jolly. Mm-hmm. And it was a Cornish miner, and his servant came to serve him at dinner and brought him a dirty napkin, and allegedly Miner Jolly then stabbed the servant in the neck. He was dining with another miner and his servant. They had an altercation beforehand where the servant said, well, you didn't give me any soap to wash the napkin, so I don't have a clean one. And then that was the point that he was stabbed. He made it out of the house and down the road, where he was found and treated. And the case went to court, and the other servant that witnessed it said he had seen Miner Jolly stab his servant. But by the time it went to court, the other servant had changed his story and said that he hadn't seen it. And so Miner Jolly, Mr. Jolly, was acquitted, and his friend's servant was convicted of perjury. And we felt that well, you never know, but it sounded pretty much like Mr. Jolly was the guilty one in that story. And yet, because of the inequalities that existed, because he was the European and higher status, it went the wrong way. But obviously this is speculation. I don't want to be sued by any relatives of Mr. Jolly.
If there are any Jollies out there, I mean, this all happened a long time ago.
Well, our bass and whistle player, his last name is Jolly, but as far as we're aware, he's not a relation.
Okay. So, just talking about how you wove these stories, we heard about one, of course, but if you can just tell us, I mean, say you take a story like this, how do you make a song out of it?
I think that was a good example of us trying to recreate something musically without words to tell the story. We tried to do it all instrumentally. So the track Miner Jolly on the album, it doesn't have any lyrics. So we can't obviously kind of specifically tell that story, but what we can try and do is kind of create the mood. So the piece of music that we wrote has a few sort of devices that we use to try and convey the slight kind of uneasy and the uneasy feeling, and also the kind of the slight clash between the two cultures. So right in the middle of that tune, there's a section which is almost like a drum battle or a percussion battle, where we have the one drummer playing the sort of drum kit, and then we have Venki playing the tabla, and and it's supposed to represent a kind of, you know, like a tug of war of the sort of court case and who did it, who didn't do it, and so yeah, although we can't sort of specifically tell a story, yeah, we've tried to create the kind of the mood of the piece.
Right.
Sometimes as well that words wouldn't do justice to it as well, or that, you know, we'd be approaching it from a certain angle, or whereas because music doesn't have words, there's a really famous quote by Hans Christian Andersen that says, "Where words fail, music speaks." And I think it's that thing that we can all listen to the music from the same starting point, I think.
Right. Yeah. Any, one of the other songs, so the original, I mean, there are no original lyrics as such, right? I mean, mostly you've taken sort of very traditional Cornish songs and then mixed it with, I mean, and the hymns, of course, right? I mean, or are there any songs which have original lyrics?
But there are a couple. Yeah, there are a couple. So, Lead Kindly Light, which I did with Gayatri Chandrasekhar and Naila Saldana, that takes the traditional hymn and uses that as the chorus. And then I wrote the verses to reflect the role of women at KGF, and Gayatri helped me with the research for that. So that's a real mixture within one song of original and traditional. And Rich, you wrote Man of Letters, didn't you?
Right,
Yes,
of course, yeah. I was, of
I'm
course.
substituting some of the words that Pauline, who was born there, you know, some of her actual words, but then some of the influences from the letters as well. But essentially completely new tune and composition.
Right. So for Lead Kindly Light, like Laura, when you say that, spoke about the lives of the women there, what was the source for that? Like, where did you draw the source material from for the lyric?
Well, the first verse that talks about the Indian women and children that worked above ground, that was information that Gayatri Chandrasekhar gave me. I'd read her book and then I asked her a bit more in detail about that. And then then there's a verse that talks about the Cornish women's experience where they have to, and that was using reports from the newspaper archives mainly, and then just imagining what it must have felt like to leave, if you've never left Cornwall before, and then all of a sudden you're on a ship for weeks and then arrive in India, and just that it was that describes the feeling of leaving your home and being scared, but then coming to KGF and finding you have a community there already that welcomes you. And then the final verse was to recognize the work of the women, the nurses and midwives in the community, because I know they were, had a really important role there. So I just wanted to, I know a lot of mining talks about the kind of male roles because obviously it's the men going underground, but I just really wanted to recognize that actually the women were also crucial to the community. So.
Right. So I just had like a kind of a final question really, which all three of you can take turns to answer. I wanted to know, like, you guys have been with this journey, like on this journey for like almost 2 years now, I guess, right? And I mean, how has it changed you in terms of, like emotionally, intellectually, and in terms of your music? What have you taken away from this project? What have you learned? How have you grown?
Oh, shall I go first? Give you time to think.
Yeah.
You go first. You go first.
I suppose a big part is just having completely different influences musically. I've always been quite into sort of local, like wherever I am, I like to find the kind of like the local traditional music, or and kind of immerse myself in that. This was quite a new experience, and I did actually try and write a piece of music, not to be an Indian piece of music because I'm not really capable of that, but but to make music that references Indian music, that was a completely new experience, because I've never really looked beyond my immediate vicinity for inspiration. But certainly, I think as well, being able to actually go there and just be bowled over by this amazing culture that's so kind of, when I first got to India, I was a bit shell shocked, just because there's just so much vibrancy and you know, and busyness and life, and so that's certainly impacted the kind of music that I was composing.
Yeah, I think for me, like it sounds over the top, but I'd say in some ways it did completely change my life. Just being able to do something so massive feels huge, and the connections we've made and the relationship side of it has been enormous, I think, for me, and it just feels such a privilege. Even when I was listening to Pooja sing on Am I Born to Die, I started to cry. That's how much it means to me, really. And I think musically it just stretched us so far that it's an amazing thing.
I think something about thinking that you know a history or that you understand the history, that I looked back, because I thought about and written about Cornish emigration, and that was 9 years ago, and I looked back and there was no mention of India then in the stuff that I had written. And so to think that, and that's one part of history, so you know, you can start to think about all the other aspects of history that we think we understand, and actually there are probably a lot more viewpoints and things that need to be taken into account when thinking about that. Another thing I think was, when we approached it, you know, we really questioned how will these two musics fit together? Is it even possible? But actually the similarities that we said about, you know, Venki's male choir and then the cathedral male choir, that they've got such a similar, in many ways, approach and story with music, you know, getting a classical training. So that was quite wonderful, really, to think these two cultures, thousands of miles apart, have actually approached it in a very similar way to create that end product. And I think, like Laura said about our relationship as well, that seeing that picture at the end of the launch, that there was such a sense of achievement, that the project all came together. And when we looked into the audience, and we all had family members in the audience, but then people that we'd never met before that got inspired by hearing this story and came along, and you know, the theatre was completely full, and yeah, it made us really close as a band, I think, as well.
Right. And thank you for doing it. I mean, you know, I mean, anybody who's listened to the music would kind of, you know, appreciate how beautifully you've brought these cultures together through the song, through the music, through, I mean, you know, just the whole feeling that you bring together in the album. Laura, why don't we sign off by you just telling people how they can listen to the music, how they can download it, where they can buy the album if they want to, and yeah.
Yeah, well, firstly, I'm sorry we talked so long, because I know we haven't left enough time for questions, and we thought it was a half-hour presentation, so I'm really sorry about that. If you do have questions, or you want to ask anything or tell us anything, contact us through the website, the Get in Touch page, and you can also you can download the album on all streaming platforms. I'm not sure how it works sending it to India, but we're happy to do that. If it doesn't, you can buy it through the website, but if you don't want to do that, just email us and we can arrange to send it. And yeah, all the profits will go to KGF Schools Foundation and Cornwall Heritage Trust. And you can find us on social media and everywhere like that, the Rowan Tree Music. But thank you so much for inviting us here today. It's been such a pleasure to do this.
And you can listen to the songs on the website, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's the rowantreemusic.com/
Yeah.
album. I mean, if you just go onto the website, you can see, just right on top, the Kolar Gold, it's on the bar, and just click on that and go to the music bit, and you can listen to all the songs. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and to all the participants for being here as well. There were a couple of comments in the Q&As, which you guys can also see, I guess. And yeah, so thanks. Over to you, Lekha.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been a lovely evening with all those great sounds, some of them familiar and some of them not so familiar, and such a lovely, lovely fusion to listen to. And thank you, Shrabonti, for being the bridge and for introducing us to the work that these guys have been doing. And thank you, Laura, Richard, and Tom, for that massive bit of research and for putting it together, and for putting the website together. And it has been our absolute pleasure, and it's been so lovely to have you with us. Research. Thank you, everyone. Good night, and see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.